Namaskar. We are delighted to inform Symbiosis Law School Noida, in association with Lex Witness, India's first magazine on legal and corporate affairs, THS, the law firm, Sadgamaya presents Knowledge Series on Law and Justice. As part of the series, on June 20, 21st, 26, 28, 2020 and July 4, 5 and 11, Honorable Mr. Justice C.K. Thakkar, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, Mr. K.T.S. Tulsi, Senior Advocate and Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, Mr. Vikas Pava, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, Mr. R. Venkatramani, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India and former Member, Law Commission of India, Mr. Nitin Pradhan, Senior Counsel, High Court of Bombay, Mr. Vikas Singh, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, and Mr. Gopal Sankaranarayan, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, delivered sessions respectively. It is our fortune that today we have one of the legal luminaries, Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, among us. Sir will deliver a session on fundamental rights, limitation on legislative powers. The session would be moderated by Mr. Kumar Mihir, Advocate on Record, Supreme Court of India. I would request Mr. Kumar Mihir to begin with the session and inform the audience about the rules of engagement. Over to you, Mr. Kumar Mihir.
Sir, we welcome Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi, Senior Advocate, who has graciously agreed to deliver this talk today. I would also like to welcome all the participants today. Before I invite Sir to begin the talk, I would like to lay down the housekeeping rules. All the participants can ask their questions in the Q&A box, which is visible on your screen. Sir has graciously allowed us to ask the questions as and when possible, even during the lecture. To ask live questions, you can use the raise hand icon queue, and we will let you go live. Ask your question at the end of the session. So hopefully there will be lots of questions today. Now invite Rakesh Dwivedi, Sir, to begin the Sir.
Namaskar. The subject of fundamental rights and limitations on the legislative powers is a very wide subject, and it is just not possible to cover the whole field with all its complexities and niceties in an hour's time. And given the 70 years of Supreme Court's functioning and the High Court's functioning, there are numerous nuances, numerous aspects of the subject. So many cases, so many judgments which have been delivered. So it is also not possible to take the audience through all these cases and all the judgments, the subject matter which was involved and the ratios and so on. So what I have chosen to speak about today is some broad problems in this field, more to make you think about them in future, because India is evolving. The Constitution is an organic document, a living document meant for the people to regulate their lives, to make their lives happier and better. So new problems keep on arising. You have to keep on thinking afresh, anew, about virtually all aspects of the Constitution. And the Constitution, of course, one is that few people dare to pick up the book on Constitution of India. Generally, they keep away from it. because of its generality and because of its complexities, and so much easier to pick up one branch of civil law or criminal law and concentrate on it. But it is a basic document, so we need to get a hang of it, get a hold of it, so that we can organize our thought process about the constitutional aspects which are involved in different chapters, different parts of the Constitution. But so far as fundamental right is concerned, it is immediately relevant to us because it concerns each one of us. So, how these rights have evolved, how they have grown, what more can be done about it, given the new problems which are being thrown up with the arrival of internet, the cyberspace and so on, with the various political decisions which are being taken pertaining to Kashmir, CAA and so on. So the life is throwing up so many problems, the immediate problem of Corona itself, with the migrant laborers on the street. The idea is not to blame one or the other political party, but the idea is that we think about these problems. When the judgments were delivered, these problems were not there. And if we try to look for answers just by picking up the judgments and trying to find a solution in the courts, I mean, given the fact that court itself is not a panacea of all evils and it has its own limitations and constraints. But given all that, even within the courts, these judgments which have been delivered only are but stepping stones. They are but providing you some tools which you can use to find solutions for the new problems. But if we think that they have already answered and given us some toolbox which you just have to open and then find an answer and then stick it, so that's not how it is going to be. And we have seen over the course, when this Aadhaar issue had arisen, a whole set of new problems. Right of dignity, is it a fundamental right or not? So over the last 70 years of the functioning of the Constitution, we have seen how fundamental rights have grown in ambit. Free speech and expression, 19(1)(a). Press is not written there, press was read into it. The right to information has been brought into it, the RTI Act, etc. There. You can seek information. And why not? If you have no information, what will be the speech and expression? When we pass through the schools and colleges, universities, so the education is all about giving us information about various aspects, enabling us to train our brain how to reason. So the information is at the foundation. Otherwise, the speech and expression can be just like a speech of an illiterate person. So all these have grown. Likewise, equality. In the initial phases, you would see that immediately the court was confronted with a problem that it is not possible to give perfect equality to everyone. Everybody can't be equal. All fingers are not equal. So what to do about it? So the twin test. They conceded the power to the legislature to classify with the object in view, bearing in mind that there should be a nexus and a rationale. By the time we reach 1970s, in Royappa's case, Justice Matthews says that Article 14 is antithetic to arbitrariness. And that itself became a controversy. And still, in Maneka Gandhi, it was applied to executive order. A question still remained, can you apply this to legislative enactments? McDowell said no. But recently, there have been a spate of judgments, Justice Nariman's judgment, Shaira Bano's case, and then in the context of this ArcelorMittal's case, then Puttaswamy's judgment. So finally, we have come to this, that even legislative enactments can be judged on the anvil of manifest arbitrariness emanating from Article 14. But we have, when it comes to legislatures, we have to assume, we have to grant all those assumptions, the shields which the enactment has, namely the presumption of validity, that the legislators know the life of the society and how to meet the evils which they want to. So granting a lot of margin to them, added to it the judicial restraint and so on, which are not available to the executive. So this demarcation. So all fundamental rights, I wouldn't go to each one of them, but just to tell you that all fundamental rights have been evolving. The initial thesis was that there is a penumbra of rights. So every right has a penumbra. You just don't look at the words. But Supreme Court often has been hesitating also. For example, when it comes to association and citizenship, because at least Article 19 and 15, 1, 2, and some others, they deal with rights of citizens. Citizens of India have these 7 rights in 19. And likewise 15.2, when it says that no citizen shall be prevented from enjoying these public places, wells, restaurants, and so on. Because framers were fully aware of the casteism and the degradation which it brings about to a large section of people who virtually become subhuman, not allowed to go drink water from the wells, couldn't walk on the street if some upper caste person is walking. So much of it has changed, but all these were in their mind when they provided for 15.2 for citizens. Now the question is, when you talk about 19.1c, should the company be a citizen? So there are at least half a dozen constitution bench judgments, etc., which say that companies are not citizens. But in R.C. Cooper, 1971 Supreme Court, made a little slight divergence, saying that they found that along with the company, some shareholder had been also made a party. So they said the shareholder is there who does business through the instrumentality of company, so that's fine. They can take advantage of the fundamental right and file a petition under Article 32, which itself is a fundamental right. I would feel that in some context, of course, citizen may not include company. For example, 15.2, when it talks about restaurant, etc., I mean, citizen company cannot be comprehended because the context excludes it. But if the context doesn't exclude, then in Article 19.1, so the company today, we have recognized commercial speeches also as part of 19.1a. So company does speak commercially. It takes many decisions. It controls the life of people, which affects them. And it's important for the growth of the life, economic life in the country. So the citizen in 19, time has come that the court should employ the doctrine of lifting of veil at least, because every company is ultimately collectively owned by the shareholders and the board of directors. So a company should be considered to be a citizen for the purposes of 19. Now that's again loud thinking. Has the time come or has it not yet? Because most businesses today are being done through the instrumentality of company. So this hesitation which was earlier there and the step taken in Cooper, now time has come to take another advancement and move forward. Another question which arises is, are these fundamental rights natural and inalienable rights? Many would think that this is now settled because Puttaswamy 9 judges judgment has said that this is natural and inalienable rights. I.R. Kolho has also said that. Nagaraj has said that. Quite a few judgments which talk about it. But there's, in my view, there is a contradiction because Keshwanand Bharati, which is of 13 judges, by majority of 7-6 rejects this idea of natural and inalienable. Justice Khanna doesn't approve natural and inalienable. So with the 6 dissents, he constitutes the majority on this aspect. On the question of word meaning of amend in Article 368, non-destruction of basic feature of Constitution, he joins the other 6. So basic feature cannot be emasculated or destroyed. But he doesn't hold that fundamental rights are natural and inalienable.
Sir, with your permission,
so in
a question will...
case of Indira Gandhi, he says that so fundamental rights are basic feature. But on natural and inalienable right, he doesn't agree.
Yes. One of the participants, sir, if I interject, sir, one of the participants is saying, agreeing with what you're saying, because initially there was a fundamental right of property as well, which was deleted subsequently. So if these rights are inalienable and natural in the first place, that right could not have been taken away. So you want views on that.
All right. So I think let the questions wait to the end because otherwise.
Sure. Absolutely.
I hope.
Absolutely.
So let us examine independently. Let us look to the life itself. If you go to the early man or Adi Manav and so on, there was no concept of right. It is only when the tribes began conquering other tribes, the small kingdoms and the big kingdoms start arising, and many of them started converting the conquered tribes into slaves, that the conflict between man and man started arising. And ever since, there has been a history of exploitation of man by man. From slavery, you talk about serfdom, you talk about colonialism, the 2 world wars, all these conflicts where some nations, through their might, tried to subjugate the whole population. India itself initially was invaded by the Mughals and earlier by many other invaders from the West, from Central Asia. And finally, the British ruled over us for 200 years. So the question of rights arose with these conflicts, with these struggles, the struggle of slaves for freedom, the struggles of serfs for freedom, the struggle of colonies to become free, our own freedom struggle. So many lives were lost, through which we have actually learned that these rights have to be acknowledged as natural rights. So when we say that they are natural rights, it's only to emphasize the importance of the rights, not that nature gave it to us. Yes, every religion, most religions will say that God made everybody equal. So equality is therefore natural. But that is one single right which we are still struggling to attain equality. And our Article 14 is, some judges have emphasized that not the twin test, not the non-arbitrariness, it is the achievement of equality which is mandated by Article 14. So the state has to strive through its legislative powers to equalize, of course, step by step and slowly. Now, United States have got this right of equality. So European Union talks about equality, but if you read Piketty on Capital, a French economist, and inequality is growing. In India, it is growing. We may talk of lifting of a large number of people above poverty line, but we all know that inequality is growing. The more we talk of equality, the more inequality grows. The product is the inverse, the reverse. So the point is that these rights have emerged on account of our efforts to realize in the spirit of Kant that man is an end in himself. He is not a means, he is an end in himself. So therefore, the whole philosophy underlies in this change of outlook and the emergence of fundamental rights. So when we say it is natural, it is only to emphasize the huge importance of fundamental rights today. What we have earned after spilling so much of blood, with so much of struggles in different phases of history, once we realize that, we will keep on struggling to preserve our rights and we will not lose these rights. Let me tell you that there will, as long as state is there will be attempts to reduce the rights. It is the vigilance, the consciousness of fundamental rights. And that's the only purpose. It is not to say that nature gave us all these rights in that sense. The other aspect is inalienable. As some person in the audience has said, that fundamental right to property has now been put under 300 capital A, and the Supreme Court is struggling hard to make it a human right again. In some land acquisition cases, they say, oh, all right, you have removed it and kept it out, but doesn't matter, location is not important. Property, though in 300A, is a human right now, recognized by court. And rightly so, because what was being attacked earlier was property as a means of production, but today we feel that property, we are moving towards liberalization. So property, ultimately, how do you, all these internet and laptops and all these are property now. How do you have freedom of speech and expression, which has been enhanced multifold by the emergence of new technology? Now that new technology is property. So we come back to the most vital growth which happened was that Gopalan was overruled. Maneka Gandhi and this printing press case in 71, R.C. Cooper and this Puttaswamy, all taken together, have now nailed Gopalan is not only dead, cremated, but it is now completely wiped out. So these fundamental rights are not independent silos. They don't exist in separation from each other. They lend strength to each other. They infuse each other with life. When Article 21 in Puttaswamy's an earlier judgment was said that procedure established by law does not mean any procedure. Fair, just and reasonable procedure, they said in Maneka Gandhi. From where did they? They said that reasonableness runs through everything, all of it. So therefore, Article 14 and 19, which expressly were stated or understood to have this idea of reasonableness, so they inject reasonableness in 21. So that is what is meant by these, all these rights need to be seen as integral, as connected, as strengthening each other. Another example, though not in the cases, and perhaps some judgments, earlier judgments may need a relook there. Now, freedom of speech, when you look at it individually, we all speak and we all utilize internet, this, that, but there's another aspect. Article 19(1)(c), when it talks of association, when you speak as on an associational platform, the strength of your speech is enhanced. So the group rights, when a right is exercised jointly by several people, the strength of that right. We see on the roads everywhere. Look at when this Floyd incident in America, the whole world is agitated because of the manner in which Floyd was killed by the policeman. If one individual family or few people would have spoken, there would have been little strength in that voice. So that speech and expression, the protest, that got strength because of the multitude in various countries. So when you speak with the strength of multitude behind, with the group strength, then 19(1)(a) becomes exercised effectively. So therefore, that's another example that these rights are all the time to be seen as integral, connected, strengthening each other. And the other aspect is that, which was emphasized in these cases, that when you examine the validity of the legislature, then legislature cannot say that my object was only business and trade, so I will not answer 19(1)(a). I will not answer 21 and 14. Just look at it, look at my object and decide the matter on the basis of the right to which it pertains. That was Gopalan. So business will be tested only on 19(1)(g). Why? Because the legislature has very wide powers under 19(6) to impose restriction in public interest. But if it has an impact, an effect, direct effect on free speech and expression, then the legislature will have to answer the test of 19(2), which is narrow. You don't find public interest in 19(2). So the other importance of this integral approach is that the legislative power has to justify itself in a different manner. If it had been Gopalan, the approach would have been different. But now the courts will see if there are 3 rights which are being impacted, then the test for each one of them has to be satisfied by the legislation. So therefore, but the point which I was emphasizing was that though these rights are integral, but they are not inalienable. The court is wrong there completely. The moment you recognize the restrictions, because 19(1)(a) does not exist in isolation. It exists in Article 19 along with 19(2). 19(1)(g) exists along with 19(6). So the moment you have the power of the state to impose reasonable restrictions in the interest of the heads prescribed, then to that extent, your right becomes alienable. Now, the moment one joins army, then because of Article 33, your fundamental rights get further restricted. Even the right to form association and trade unions get restricted. Emergency, 352, fundamental rights suspended. Agrarian reforms, Article 14, 19, all, the moment you put in 9 schedules, 31A, 31B, 31C, notwithstanding the fact that they are now to be examined on the angle of basic feature. But fact remains that they are alienable. Now, Keshwanand Bharati, what does it say? You can abridge the basic feature, but you cannot emasculate it. Now, it's another conundrum. At what point of time the abridgment becomes emasculation is a question of degree, which will be decided, of course, as the Keshwanand Bharati judgment says, on a case-to-case basis. What is basic feature and is it emasculation? But insofar as the judgment envisages abridgment, permits the legislature to abridge, that is alienation. So alienation can happen on account of our choices, on account of our contracts of employment. It can happen on account of poverty above all. A poor man surrenders most of his fundamental rights. And alienation can happen on account of fear, like the coronavirus fear. We are all very happy, surrendered, sitting at home. We have jailed ourselves. Today, life has become important. To save the life, all rights given up. Comfortably, conveniently. So therefore, fundamental rights are not inalienable. This proposition, this statement has been given. It looks very nice, very felicitous. Natural, inalienable right. Every moment the rights are being alienated. First of all, when we cast our vote and we elect our leaders in the parliament and the government comes, we alienate our so many rights to them to govern us, hoping that they will act with respect to our lives, our employments, our movements, our enjoyments, in our interest. So therefore, these rights are integral. These rights are hard-won. They are important. We have to be conscious. At every turn, we must examine. We must pause and examine. What are we giving up? Do we need to give it up? How much should we give up? And how should we fight for our rights or not? And fight we must. So they are alienable rights. Because of this problem, the question arises, how do we look at restrictions in 19(2) to 6, or in the matter of equality, or in the matter of Article 21, life and personal liberty, when our dignity is impacted, when our life, which is no more merely our limbs, but all aspects of life. So how easy it is to say it includes shelter, it includes this, it looks all very nice. Where was this shelter and all those food and life for the migrant workers? The spectacle which we saw was unusual only because it was a spectacle in collectivity, in such large numbers. We were seeing people walking on the roads, dying on the rail tracks and falling from the trucks and so on, crowding for food, being sprayed all over. But let me tell you, whoever is conversant with rural India knows that our villages are divided, even hamlets are divided on the basis of caste. There is a Thakuran, means where Thakurs live. There is a Bamanoti where Brahmins live. There is a Ahiran where Yadavs live. And so on and so forth. Now these migrant laborers who reap the harvest in Punjab or be it in their own state, in UP, in their hometowns, in villages, they perform the same function. We have seen incidents of their being lynched, the untouchability with, imagine a Constitution of India in Article 17, a fundamental right. We only talk of 14, 19, 21, and we conveniently look over this. How many cases are there of 17? Who's bothered about 17? Nobody has filed PILs to safeguard these rights. It's a declaration. But untouchability still exists. May not be that virulent, but exists. Nobody files a PIL for those. So those people were individually in small groups. They suffer day in and day out in the same fashion. Their fundamental rights stand alienated, subjected to the landowners. I'm telling you this because I've worked amongst the landless laborers for at least 8 years after joining this profession in Allahabad in the Jamunapar area. And once we raised an issue of giving minimum wages, and the landlords told the workers, now you remain shut in your houses. We will not allow you to go in Disha Maidan in the farms. I hope you understand this Disha Maidan. This one simple threat is sufficient to subject them to whatever the landlords say. And good old days, even in Kerala, there was one tradition that the ladies of the downtrodden and Dalits will not wear a cloth above the waist. And if some Nambudripad Brahmin is coming, then they must stand away 36 paces. If it is Nair, then they should be 12 paces away. All fundamental rights, therefore, are alienated, alienable, but we have to be very watchful. We must protect these fundamental rights. They are valuable, and when we come to restrictions on the power of the legislature, then as you all know that Article 245, 246 read together make the power of the legislature subject to the constitution, and part 3 is part of the constitution, therefore they must respect the fundamental rights. And the other constitutional provisions also, including Article 300 capital A, right to property now. Now here again there are two aspects. The first and the more important is the power of the legislature to make law is not given to curtail the rights merely for the heck of curtailment. It is a power which has been given to the legislature to effectuate our fundamental rights, to facilitate our fundamental rights. So the legislature in the first instance must do all those things which are essential and necessary to make our fundamental rights more effective, stronger. So reasonable restrictions, for example, when it says that speech expression can be restricted in the interest of defamation, that is only to protect the reputation of somebody. Contempt of court, so that the institution of court can function efficiently and independently. Because all this helps us in protecting our rights in the court, in seeking relief in the court. If the courts are strong, independent, then our rights are safer. So these restrictions which are envisaged are restrictions which should be only to such extent as enables us to exercise the fundamental rights. Now, some judgments way back stated that fundamental rights are fundamental, not the restrictions. Maneka Gandhi also and some other judgments. Sirvai criticizes this very strongly in the 4th edition and says that all fundamental rights have been given along with the power of restriction. So you can't say one is fundamental and the other is not. But here again, differing from Mr. Sirvai, I would say that when the courts say that fundamental rights are fundamental, not restriction, it means that don't unduly restrict. When it says restrictions have to be reasonable, they have to be necessary. Therefore, they should not be excessive. And now, judgments have coined this expression proportionality. In Aadhaar case, some of the lawyers referred to the judgment of Justice Barak of South Africa and proportionality and so on. In my turn, I told the judges that why do we need to go to South Africa for this concept of proportionality? Our Supreme Court has been the front runner, and in AIR 1957 Supreme Court, you will find V.G. Rao's case, Justice Patanjali Shastri. He has clearly spoken of the restrictions not being excessive. The idea of proportionality has been beautifully expressed by Justice Patanjali Shastri in V.G. Rao's case. And Justice Chandrachud has in his judgment extracted that paragraph. So therefore, the idea that fundamental rights are fundamental means the restriction should be as little as possible. Why as little as possible? Because if it is little as possible, then your fundamental rights are not only protected, but they get full play. The larger is the dimension of the restrictions, irrespective of the objective, the purpose, the public interest, or the head in the interest of which the state is legislating, the narrower will be the right. So this interplay of right and restriction, since right is fundamental, the restriction has to be, if one uses the American expression, narrowly tailored. I am very apprehensive in using American expressions because their constitution is differently crafted. They don't have these restrictions, etc., specified with elaborateness as our constitution does. Our ethos is also different. Our history is different. So, like if you start adopting due process and all this, it looks very nice to adopt these expressions, but it's very vague expression, due process. So just the courts can do anything. Since the American Constitution doesn't provide for clarity on the restrictions, therefore the courts have devised these expressions to create their limitations. But for us, it is enough, and due process, finally, Justice Chandrachud has set at rest, is an American concept, and our court has all throughout rejected it. So when I say narrowly tailored, it only means have your restrictions casted in such a manner that they are not excessive. They are just enough to help the state in attaining its objective in the legislation, and not beyond that. And the objective also should be closely intertwined with the heads which are prescribed. So finally, when we come to the limitations, we find first of all, the legislature has to look at its competence in the list. The three lists, the distribution of power, the federalism. And we have had a lot of cases in the Supreme Court, the struggle between the state and the center with regard to power to legislate. But once the law is competent, thereafter also the legislature has to take care. The authorities, the regulators, because we are moving more and more towards regulators now. NCLT, and we have TRAI, and we have electricity regulators, SEBI and RBI, and so a host of regulators. All these regulators and the state, when we talk of state, all these lawmaking, rule-making, regulation-making bodies come in. And they have to see that the objective of their law has a close nexus with the heads which are permitted. Or as Justice Chandrachud has said in Puttaswamy, legitimate purpose. Second, the restriction should be reasonable, narrowly tailored. But in all these matters, the values of the judge also come into play. I have seen during my career that in many matters which are value loaded, it makes a huge difference as to what are the values of the judge who are deciding. it is not to demean the approach of those judges, but we are all brought up in a society in a particular manner and we all don't share all the values. So, and judge cannot be expected to leave his values at home when he sits on the plush chair. So what he thinks, ultimately he is the repository of the public conscience, the public interest. Of course, this is not to say that the judges are arbitrary. They have laid down criteria, principles to determine. But the value also has a role to play. And that is why we find that in large number of important constitutional matters, you will find the division, it is 3-2, 7-6, 6-5. Now that speaks volumes about how the judges are thinking. They are all having a particular mindset, values, and they look at things from that angle. So these are the two aspects of when we talk about limitations of legislative powers. One, that in the first instance, the legislature must facilitate the rights. And this idea has been now very clearly accepted and expressed in the judgments of the Supreme Court in Nagaraj case and in Puttaswamy's case. So when the Aadhaar Act says that this Aadhaar system will be used to fulfill some needs of the downtrodden and poor people, for example, Jan Dhan Yojana and so on. Again, I'm not into the polemics of these things. Political parties have their own perceptions. Or, for example, in these difficult times, it was said that food for work, what is it called? Program.
So that Manrega or?
Manrega. So now these are programs which facilitate life. In difficult times, when people have no food, no work, and they can't survive, then right to food, Manrega, Jan Dhan, and so on, all these are meant to that. So in Aadhaar case, the question was that it is this what we argued, the Attorney General also, that the state is actually enlivening the life of the poor people by this provision, Section 7. So that's how the issue arose, that there is a clash of fundamental right of privacy and dignity and at the same time there is, and as Nelson Mandela said when he was asked about dignity and privacy and all that, he said, give the poor people food and clothes and they will get dignity. So there will be cases of clash of fundamental rights. One fundamental, even a clash of my fundamental right to dignity and privacy vis-a-vis my fundamental right to remain alive. So what is the use of privacy and dignity if I am not alive? So I must get work and food under all these provisions, and then once I am taken care of with an opportunity to work and to take care of my life, and then the question of privacy and dignity makes sense. So often you will find there are situations where there is a conflict not only of the same individual, but there can be a conflict between right of one person and the right of another person. As we talked about right to reputation and dignity of mine vis-a-vis the right of yours to speak and express whatever you want vis-a-vis mine, action. The two rights are in conflict. And the Supreme Court here, in a smaller bench of 5 judges in the same Puttaswamy, has come to this conclusion that balancing Now here comes the idea of balancing. The two rights have to be balanced. As also it is said that my right to speak stops where other person's right begins. So I have been talking now of balancing the rights, the restrictions, the reasonableness, the non-excessiveness and so on. These are the various aspects. Even the legislature can make a law balancing the rights of people. But ultimately the idea is the balance should be struck in such a manner that while striking the balance, you don't destroy the right totally of one person. So has to be somewhere in between, the Madhyam Marg of Buddha. Legislature can draw this line, or courts will do the final balancing if they find that the balance has not been properly struck. So if you categorize, ultimately, one, the legislature must facilitate. Two, when it legislates, it should have a legitimate purpose. And three, its exercise of power should be proportional, non-excessive, reasonable. So these are the limitations on the legislative power. And anybody who wishes to challenge a legislation can take recourse to all these principles to question the law. Ultimately, the fundamental rights, when strengthened and enlivened, and when exercised by us, not only for our benefit, that's not the ultimate goal of a fundamental right. It is one of the important aspects that we elevate ourselves, we educate ourselves, we create, we invent. All these fundamental rights, particularly speech and expression. Speech and expression does not mean speaking something rambling or abusive or something. It means that we train our brain to speak and express in a manner that not only we elevate ourselves, but we create and invent and construct in a manner that the whole human society benefits. Think of those who created the language. Think of those who created the numerals, the science, the arts, the literature. It is meant for that. It is meant for enabling the making of policy, the criticizing of policy, which is also part of the making of policy. Criticism flows from one end to the other, everywhere. But the object of criticism is to construct. So all fundamental rights are actually duties. It's not a selfishness. It's not meant to create a selfishness within ourselves. But it is meant to make us conscious that we have got these tools, constitutional entitlements. You may call them natural or not, inalienable or not, but they help us to realize ourselves, to elevate ourselves, to create, to construct, and to build. That's the objective. And duties, therefore, look upon it as a duty. It is our duty to exercise our fundamental right, if I may put it like that. Right now, I'm not referring to Article 51A, which enshrines a number of duties. They are also important. It says renounce all practices derogatory to women. Yet we have Shabrimala. Many of you may not agree, but we are sticking to some irrational, superstitious ideas which have been squashed by science and medical science. And curiously, the Supreme Court wants to re-examine. Article 51A says, renounce all practices derogatory to women. That's the problem, that fundamental rights we look upon, whether it is right to religion under 25, 26, right to education, right, whatever right. Take it as a duty. Duty to yourself, duty to your family, duty to your society, duty to the human beings as a whole. And then you can add your directive principles and fundamental duties and everything. The idea of the whole constitution is that the whole society is made capable, has opportunities, and it marches forward and leads the world, builds our country in such a manner that we are strong in all respects, strong not to subjugate others, but strong to lead others towards happiness. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an enlightening talk. We have a large number of questions in the Q&A box, and a large number of people are queued up to ask live questions also. So with your permission, we'll start with the live questions, and then if time permits, we'll take the questions in the Q&A box, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mihir. Apurva Verma, please unmute yourself and ask a question live.
Yes.
Apurva Verma,
morning,
please
sir.
unmute yourself. Sankalp, please wait for your turn. Apurva Verma, please unmute yourself and ask a question live.
Sir, actually, I wanted to ask that in the light of the statement of Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, isn't it good that we have fundamental rights which can limit the legislative powers?
First, that one of the purposes is to limit the power. Yes. And your power to utilize your freedom of speech and expression to criticize the government, its policies. These are all checks. Form association, to lend group strength to your voice. All these are limitations. And that's the intention, because power corrupts. But also that is to enable the wielders of power to exercise their power for the benefit of man. But our experience has been very sad, that those who are having powers, they just go mad with power, they become power drunk. So you're right, fundamental rights are meant to act as a check.
Thank you, sir. Avinash Vishen, can you unmute yourself and ask your question live? Avinash Vishen, please unmute yourself and ask your question live.
I think voice is cracking.
Avinash, can you speak a little loudly, please?
Yes.
Sir, my question is that you stated that all the reasonable restrictions are essentially there to facilitate the right itself, right? And you stated that these reasonable restrictions should be carefully crafted. Now, I draw your attention to Article 19(2), when it talks about the reasonable restriction of decency or morality, which is very subjective and can cover anything under the sun, and is regularly used to say that any form of dissent is actually covered under this. Do you agree that this would therefore amount to an unreasonable restriction because it is not carefully crafted and does not facilitate the right itself?
Now, these are practical questions which will arise with a particular factual settings, and in some particular factual settings, it can be held to be. Of course, the moral values also keep on changing from time to time. We have seen the judgments on LGBTs and some other judgments. So the principles of morality keep changing also, and even at a given time, you see even the judges, the judgment which was delivered by Delhi High Court Justice A.P. Shah was initially upheld by the Supreme Court, reversed by the Supreme Court, sorry, Justice Singhvi's judgment. And then recently it has been overturned. So the values also keep on changing.
Sir, I think sir has been muted.
So Rakesh, sir, can you please unmute yourself at your end? Thank you, sir.
So I was talking about the values differing even amongst judges at a particular point of time. I refer to Justice A.P. Shah's judgment, which was reversed initially, then now it has been restored. But you still find in Russia now they have passed a constitutional amendment making the same activity punitive, banned, prohibited. So, yes, in the field of constitutional law, there will be very many situations where the moral values will be different. That's why I said that the value of judges also have a play. And this will happen. One should not be too much disturbed by this variance or divergences in the judiciary, or because ultimately these divergences in moral value exist in the society. So many people think this is obnoxious activity, and many people think the time has come to decriminalize it. Some people say, all right, you have decriminalized it, but you can't allow marriages between same sex. But those people want the society to move towards acceptance of marriages as in the Western countries. So all this is in a state of flux, and particularly, as you say, in the field of morality. Now this expression morality also occurs in Article 26 in the field of religious rights. And as I was referring to Sabrimala, again that's can we say that debarment of women on that particular ground from worshipping is immoral?
So with your permission, sir,
Morality, constitutional morality, or what is it? Yes.
There's some disturbance coming from the mic of your iPad or your device. It's cracking up the voice, sir.
I don't know. It's all.
Yeah, now it's fine,
Yes,
sir. Now
it's much better now, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So anyway, morality is one issue where there will be a lot of divergences.
Thank you, sir. Ayushman, please unmute yourself and ask a question live.
Yeah, very good evening, sir. Sir, my question is about how you spoke about the Gopalan case, how fundamental rights are not independent silos, but they merge with each other. Gopalan took a different view, Justice Fazali dissented, but in R.C. Cooper it was held that each fundamental right is to be read together. So as you all know, Gopalan challenged the validity of a preventive detention law. And the contention was that it violates 19(1)(d), which is the right to free movement, that is to freely move through the territory of India, and Article 21, which is right to life and personal liberty. So my question is that how do we read 19(1)(d) and 21 together in light of the R.C. Cooper judgment for a law such as the preventive detention law. So if you're not allowed to move freely, how does that merge with your liberty under Article 21? Like you said that fundamental rights are not independent.
So preventive detention laws are sanctified even by Article 22.
Yeah.
So there are separate provisions for it which enable the legislature to have those provisions. But such provisions by their very nature will have to be tested very strictly, because it is only on suspicion that you preventively detain a person. And the period of detention can be fairly long. So, and the incarceration is also in the jails and not in Aga Khan Palace. So, the laws are sanctified, and once you are imprisoned, then the person who is imprisoned necessarily loses his fundamental right to movement throughout the territory of India. 19(1)(d) will not be that efficacious in that context. But when I was talking about Gopalan, so I refer to it because of the principle which was laid down by Gopalan. But if the preventive detention law is also very excessive, then it can also be struck down on the ground, not of 19(1)(d), but 21 today itself. 22 cannot be read in isolation. It will have to respect 21 and 14.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Meenakshi Kaul, please unmute yourself and ask your question live.
Yeah, am I audible, sir? Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, a very
Please
good
go
afternoon
ahead.
to you, sir. So my question is, I'll divide it in two parts. Now, in abrogating Article 35A, where the Parliament has exceeded its powers, now, if so, can the executive action of 1954 be not said as transgression of powers not supported by law? Secondly, if we at all feel that the introduction of this article was bad, now then how can its abrogation be considered as unjustified and is being debated? Like in Bhagavad Gita also we have na asta vidyate bhava na abhava vidyate sata. That means unreal has no existence and real does not cease to be. So I really need to seek your opinion regarding the same, sir.
So this real does not cease to be, perhaps is in the context of God, I think.
Yes. Yes, sir.
So when we talk of constitution, it is the material world which we are dealing with. I don't know much of religion, but this Corona period gave me an opportunity to glance through Dr. Radhakrishnan's book of Indian philosophy. So I think, if I'm not wrong, it is supernatural being, that Maya, Vidya, and all those things.
So in that case, sir, if
but 35A, which you are talking, 35A, which you are talking about, is regarding Kashmir or something.
Yes, sir. Basically, 35A is it's a special rights and privileges to the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir, sir.
Yeah. So what do you want to know about it?
Your opinion, sir. I have n number of questions. If you permit me, I can, proceed with the next one. Maybe that can be correlated to one another.
See, this matter is before the Supreme Court now. It's a live issue there. And 35A, of course, you are absolutely right. You will be having 1,000 questions.
So,
but very difficult to answer all the questions here, right?
Okay, sir. So, constitution is supreme law, right? Agreed. But where is the constitutionalism gone when it comes to Kashmiri Pandits? When it comes to our rights, including constitutions, they are denied, not by constitution, but in the working of constitution.
If you ask my opinion, 35A, all those things should not have been there at all.
Okay, sir.
There are so many things. Of course, it is against Kashmiri Pandits, not only but that, but you see, if the Kashmiri girl marries here, she is deprived of any right to hold property in Kashmir. But if man marries, he continues to enjoy the right to hold property, to acquire property. It's a clear discrimination of 14. 35A has been introduced into the Constitution by virtue of Article 370, a presidential order. In a way, it is a legislative exercise by the executive, the president, acting on the advice of central cabinet, central government. So by executive action, you are denying fundamental rights, something very serious. But those were the situations where Kashmir was acceding to India and there were problems. If we look at this issue in abstract, answers will be different. But if you take yourself back to 1947-48, when two nations, the British conspired to divide India and Pakistan into two parts, and it also surrendered the paramountcy to the Indian states, made all the kings independent. So that was a scheme virtually of balkanizing India. But such was the force of the freedom struggle that most of the kings acceded to India and few of them to Pakistan. Kashmir was a singular problem which remained. So now this history will take a lot of time to talk about. But ultimately it was in those situations where the first war between India and Pakistan was fought no sooner they became independent and over Kashmir. And in those scenarios, the then government in its wisdom thought fit to have 370, 35A by presidential orders. Probably by 1954 order it was brought in. So correct me if I'm wrong on this. So those were the times. And Jawaharlal Nehru then, in my view, mistakenly went to United Nations, internationalized the issue. Mountbatten played his own role in this. But it was all those times. You can't consider these issues. But the point is, should these provisions continue? Thus now we are 70 years from obtaining independence. So 370, etc. has been rightly annulled in my view. I have already written about it and probably it was published in Tribune. And 35A obviously has to go. So I am supportive of the deletion and its destruction. It's another matter now the Supreme Court will examine that the procedure which was adopted by the central government in doing away with these provisions, whether it stands the test of constitutional procedure or not, that court will examine. Any other question on Kashmir?
No, sir, but
Thank you, sir. Madhukar Sharma, please unmute yourself and ask your question live. Madhukar Sharma.
Yes. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, I have two questions. Question
Yes.
number one is that, please correct me if I am wrong, that Article 19, right to freedom of speech and expression. Nature of this right is that there is no positive duty of the state towards me. I can exercise my right to freedom of speech and expression only if the resources are available at my disposal. At the most, state cannot put any restriction, or if any restriction is to be imposed, that will be as per the restrictive clauses. On the other hand, the right to information, as per the RTI Act, the state has a positive duty towards me. Means to say, I can enforce the state to provide me the information. So how logical it is to draw that right to information RTI Act flows from Article 19 as per laid down by the Supreme Court in State Information Commissioner versus State of Manipur. So this is my first question. And if you allow me, should I speak the second question as well, sir, or later on?
As you feel like.
Okay, sir.
So let me answer your question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Article 21 and 19 are differently structured, no doubt. But the power to legislate does not emanate from 19.2. The power of the legislature to legislate arises from 245, 246, 248, etc. Read with the 3 lists in the 7th schedule, which prescribe the field. So, the duty of the legislature to effectuate the fundamental rights under 19 also arises, or rather exists with the state by virtue of its power. The power under 245, 246 can certainly be used to make a law to provide us with all these technologies which are available to enhance our free speech and expression. Not only by abstaining, but by actually facilitating and working for improvement of technology, by creating universities, etc., which come out with the scientific community, which you come out with new technologies, your free speech, expression, association, movement. After all, when the state made a law and provided for construction of metro, our right to movement has been enhanced. You don't need to go to 19.2 or 19.4 and 19. They are only saying that if the state wants to restrict, then the restriction should be reasonable and tailored to the heads which are prescribed there. But 19.2 to 19.6 are not the end of the world for legislature. The primary source of lawmaking is in 245, 246. This is only to circumscribe the lawmaking power vis-a-vis fundamental right. So if you want to restrict, keep 19.2 to 6 in mind. Keep the twin test and non-arbitrariness and manifest arbitrariness tests of 14. Keep the proportionality and other tests of 21. All these in mind when you are wanting to restrict. But ultimately, speech, expression, all the rights of 19 are actually, had its 19 not been there, they would have been part of right to life. What is life if you can't speak and express? So, the duty of the state to facilitate the exercise of fundamental right exists in the Constitution. There are directive principles also, which they have to keep in mind. The state has to, then you have this right to education, Article 21A. Is the state not facilitating by making the right to education compulsory up to 14, by providing nearby schools, free education, compulsory education? The state is facilitating speech and expression of those people who will now be compulsorily educated. Otherwise, they would have roamed around in the village behind cattle. And what would have been their speech and expression? So please keep in mind that 19.2 to 6 are only prescribing the limitation on the law-making power when the law seeks to enter the domain of fundamental rights. But if the Parliament does not want to restrict but wants to facilitate, then 19.2 and 6 don't come in the way.
Yes, sir. So may I ask second question, sir?
Yes.
So second question is that in PUCL versus Union of India 2003, it was said by the Supreme Court that I have a right to have some information about the person contesting election because through my right to franchise, I will be expressing myself. Can this right be extended to the political parties as well? If the answer is yes, then how it will stand in the matter of electoral bonds, sir?
See, again, I am
Political parties could bomb.
appearing in the electoral bond matter for the Election Commission of India. And we have supported the bonds, but the Election Commission of India says that it should be transparent. It should be known to people who has donated to whom. Otherwise, this is a matter again which is of electoral reforms, larger questions will come in there. But right to information, sorry, your question was what about? Can you repeat your question, please?
Madhukar?
Gone.
Yeah, I think he's gone, sir. Should I call the next?
Let's move on then if he is.
Very well. Sankalp Dwivedi. Sankalp, can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sir, as you mentioned, due to COVID, government has restricted our movement, but we saw mass movement of migrant laborers throughout the country to their respective states, which violates their fundamental right. As any sort of movement without proper social distancing is the threat to their life. So, sir, I want to know your views on this matter that the state somehow failed to ensure proper shelter and proper food like basic necessities.
See, I look at these problems somewhat differently because when a situation like a pandemic arises, a pandemic is something much graver than an emergency, and you have an invisible enemy, the coronavirus, nobody can see unless you go behind some microscopes and so on. Now, the whole world, look at the scenario. So the lockdowns had to be imposed. No state, no government of any country has any prior precedent of dealing with such kind of pandemics. It's a very unusual thing. There are some larger issues about it, how it arose, where it arose, and so on. Keeping that aside, so our government also had to act under the Disaster Management Act, and the laws may be insufficient. All of things suddenly has happened. You can't expect that instead of dealing with the situation, the government must first run to the parliament, convene the parliament, make a new law. But even if they were to do that, they know hardly anything about. There is no cure. What do? Lockdown cannot be permanent. Lockdown will be 2 months, 3 months. If you continue the lockdown for a very long time, don't restore your economy, then people will become unemployed in larger and larger numbers, and more in unemployment and more hunger deaths. So it's a very difficult problem on both sides. I mean, what do? So this kind of a balancing in an unknown situation where there is no precedent, some actions have been taken. The other thing is that no government can on its own handle this problem. Not even all the governments taken together can handle it. It is the civil society which must also come forward, or rather should have come forward in much larger numbers. It is unfortunate that many people were simply talking about and criticizing, but notwithstanding their capabilities, they did not come forward to aid and assist the migrant workers. It is one thing to say, look, the government is not doing anything, government is... Now this problem of this magnitude, where people are running helter-skelter quite often on account of rumors, on account of fears. I mean, the civil society, in my view, has also failed here. Let's not only be critical of government, let us put a question to ourselves, what have we done? Have we done our bit to the maximum extent? Or we have simply tried to sit at home and just shut ourselves up and save our own lives and forget, and then watch the TV and issue a statement in the morning in the press and criticize. Of course, criticize by all means, criticize the government. Of course, government, I would agree with you that the government, on hindsight, of course, that government could have done more, much more. But if I put a question to this myself, I would get an answer that yes, even I could have done much more. Why did I not come? Was it enough for me to just hold a camera in front of that person? Why couldn't you provide to those people something there? Lot of people did. Lot of gurudwaras have done good work. I'm not trying to say that civil society did nothing, but a tiny small section. Large majority of section people who could have done much more to ensure that these people did not go hungry. But ultimately, I mean, these are very difficult questions. One should criticize, but more important to know that in situations of emergency and wars and in situation of pandemics, the biggest role is of the civil society. If we don't stand behind our army, you can't fight China. If you don't stand out and help, you can't fight pandemic. We don't help merely by putting a mask or a PPE or maintaining social distance. That is all necessary. But you have to help. I have found that people, construction workers next to my house, the people whose house was being constructed, they said, sorry, I have entered into a contract. You talk to your contractor, I will not help you. It was not my house, but I came forward to about a dozen workers there and they were helped. So that's the unfortunate part, that a lot of people, let us also learn to put a question what we are doing ourselves in such situations. Criticize the government, make it do more, but keep asking what you can do. Like Kennedy once said after winning election, ask not what America will give to you, ask what you will give to America. So ask yourself what you can do more to help people, help the doctors, help the nurses. What are we doing? We are just sitting at home, and when the doctors and the nurses and these people come from the hospital, we don't allow them to enter into the colony. There have been several such incidents. The landlords terminating their tenancies. So I think the greatest fault has been of the civil society, more than the government.
Thank you, sir. Manan Sangai, please ask a question live. Manan Sangai.
Yeah, I'll unmute. Sir, there are a couple of questions. First is regarding school fee issue during lockdown and private school charging. There is a balance. Schools say that they have administrative cost, but students say there is online coaching, there is no expense, and they are asked to pay full fees. Some states, so they have passed a circular to increase the fees, stay on increase, that is stayed by the High Court. Like Maharashtra, this is the issue. Now, what is your stand on it? What would have been the right approach here?
How is this relevant to the topic today?
So, sir, both I am coming up to this. This is one part, and the second, because the second part, there are gag orders passed, sir, here in Maharashtra for a fixed time period. Like WhatsApp or admin, if you post anything, there will be a gag order was for fixed time period. Bombay High Court stopped to intervene. No, we will not intervene. It was for a limited period. Now it's not continuing, so we will not intervene. Such trend is dangerous or not? What is your take on this also, sir? What is the solution to this kind of problems? For 20 days here, there was a gag order passed. When the courts were approached, the court said, now the time period is over. Now we will not choose to intervene in this. You gave the Floyd example, how freedom of speech was expanded to electronic media.
Right. So, see, the courts are also cognizant of the fact that this pandemic is a serious matter, and they don't want to put their fingers everywhere and create more problems. So when a matter is now over, and the gag period is over, normally it is permissible for the court to think that it is infructuous now, why intervene now since the gag is no more there. So the courts adopted is not unusual. In the past also the courts have been adopting that approach. And more so when it pertains to pandemics and all that, then it perhaps you can have a different opinion, but you can't say that if the court has chosen to bear restraint, this is what is called restraint. So they don't want to, because you see the courts are not experts in everything. And so many problems are arising, everybody is rushing to the courts to do this, do that, do that. So now they virtually want to take over, courts to take over the job of tackling of a pandemic. What do the judges know? We lawyers, how much do we know about pandemics? I think it should be best left to the government and the doctors unless things are very serious and live issues.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Pooja Kapoor, please unmute yourself and ask your question live. This will be the
Good
last live
afternoon,
question.
Good afternoon.
Hand it over to you, Mihir.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for this interactive and very informative session, sir. My question is, sir, that do you think Article 14 and 21 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees the right to equality and right to live with dignity, are violated by having different legal age for men and women to marry in India? What is your opinion, sir?
I believe in perfect equality between men and women. If the balance tilts towards the women, so much the better. So the age should be same.
Thank you, sir. That was the last live question. We have few questions which have been sent to us in the Q&A box. So I'll invite Raj. Raj has 1 or 2 questions, and then I'll take the last few questions of the day. Raj, can you ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. So one question, one of the participants have posted that the legislative powers have certain restrictions, but they also have certain positive obligations. But then in the recent times, positive obligations are negated by virtue of proportionality test, thus expanding the boundaries of legislative act. What are your views on this, sir?
Personality test means?
Proportionality test, sir.
Proportionality
Sorry?
test. Proportionality test, sir.
So what about that?
So the question, in the recent times, positive obligations are negated by virtue of proportionality test, thus expanding the boundaries of legislative act. What are your views on this, sir? This is the question which has been posed, sir.
No, proportionality test and positive obligations, they do not clash.
Sir.
Positive obligation means that you enhance the ambit of the right, the exercise of the right, aid the exercise of the right. And proportionality is something that when you seek to restrict the right, then you have to satisfy the proportionality test. Means the restriction should be proportional to the legitimate purpose which you seek to serve. Non-excessiveness. So they are two different grooves. They move into different grooves.
Thank you, sir. So one another question I will quickly ask you, and then I will hand over the platform to you. So the question I'll quote, sir, as you mentioned originally, we didn't have rights, but we imposed it later. In the words of Henry Maine, society has moved from status to contract. So would you like to suggest that a reverse of the same, that is from contract to status, is much needed in the society in today's time, sir? What are your views, sir?
So I'm not much enamored by these expressions. So these thinkers and philosophers, they have their own way of expressions, and status to contract, and from contract, social contracts of Locke and Rousseau, we moved forward to Kant and man as end in himself. And it's much more complex today. There is a status in the sense that every citizen, every person, all people of India, they are owning some rights, political rights, social rights. But there is also a field of contract. In exercise of rights, you enter into contract also. In fact, some philosophers consider that this constitution itself is a compact, it's a social contract. And our preamble starts by saying, we the people of India have given to ourselves. What is this, we the people of India? Have we contracted? To give this constitution to ourselves? Did we vote for it? Was there a referendum? Was the Constituent Assembly elected by us? Us means not, many of us were not born in, I was also not born. But the people who were living at that time in India and were citizens of India, did they vote to elect? Was there adult suffrage at that time? How was the Constituent Assembly elected? Under the Government of India Act, there were elections to the provincial legislatures, and the provincial legislatures then elected the members of the Constituent Assembly. And those elections took place on the basis of limited franchise. The educated and the property holders, they could vote. There was no adult franchise. So this is a fiction, we the people of India. Yes, we can say that even if the whole country would have voted, perhaps this constitution would have passed at that time, would have passed muster in referendum. We can assume those people who were in the assembly, they were stalwarts and they participated in freedom struggle. They had the confidence of the people of India. So in that sense, this fiction is well made, but it is nevertheless a fiction, not a reality. So where is the compact? By long course of time, 70 years, we have accepted this constitution, we have implemented this constitution, and by doing so, by not protesting against the constitution as a whole, we have virtually accepted it. So in that sense, you may say it is a social contract. Now all those theories, social contract, etc., status, contract. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Mihir, over to you now.
Over.
This is Dr. Meera Matthew. She wants to know your, because she writes that experience in India, we don't study how existing law and how they fare. Instead, for any conflict to happen and see that how courts are, whereas in US, there's a manual legislation to guide the law-making process. So in her view, she wants to know, in your view, whether the time has come where we give more importance on drafting of legislations than to see how courts have interpreted a law or has acted in a scenario.
So I would put it like this, that I would agree with her that there should be more expertise put in drafting legislation. So the laws are very poorly drafted quite often. And you find therefore that there are a spate of amendments being passed one after the other. So there should be more care bestowed in the drafts, and there should be some kind of institution which creates these experts, because drafting of legislation, once an advocate general of UP was asked to draft a legislation to get over a judgment of the court. So the preamble went on for at least about 6 pages. Whereas paragraphs went on and on and on. So when we as lawyers talk about poor drafts, if we are asked to draft, perhaps we may come out with a poorer stuff. So I agree that there should be some institution which to create experts, and good drafting is half the task done. But the other aspect that good drafting will do away with the need to interpret, I don't think so. Because the conflict which happens in the society, that conflict will keep on battling on words. The clash of rights projected as clash of ideas will go on, howsoever good the draft is. So interpretation will go on, courts will be needed to interpret.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an enlightenment lecture. So that ends the question and answer session. I'll now like to invite our teacher and our mentor, Professor Dr. C.J. Rawalli, to give us the concluding remarks.
So thank you very much for the session. And as you rightfully pointed out, that expectation of each and every citizen that the state shall do, thou shalt do, I shall not do. Because when we are talking about the pandemic situation, or be it any situation, we expect that the state or the government, respective government shall do, and I shall be provided with. And I could see that, after a long time, I could hear someone who has that feeling when it comes to, like, for example, one not having it. So be it the landless ones. Now, there are simple examples. If, as you rightfully pointed out, the term, we the people of India solemnly resolve to give ourselves, means we give it to ourselves. So where is the question of contract? But at the same time, the zamindari which was in existence, so there was a huge gap between the have and have-nots, and the ones who were sitting into the law-making body, greatly they were coming for those families only. But still those legislations were passed, the Zamindari Abolition Act was passed. At the same time, people just did not look towards the legislation, but there were several movements which were ongoing and which were started by individuals, like go to Sane Guruji or go to Acharya Vinoba Bhave. These are few which I can refer to, who rather responsible for the Buddhan movement, wherein they requested people, if you have more, could you please give so it can be shared with the one. So it was the legislation plus the movement on the part of the people. So we could see that change. So the one not having it, they were at least able to get some portion of it. And then later on, we went across the Urban Land Ceiling Act, etc., etc. Because this gap, well, this gap is widening, but of course there will be an effort that let us bridge it, let people have it, that will go on. But yes, the participation of the civil society is must. As you rightfully pointed out, because people quite often make the mistake between two terms, the restriction and the limitation. Because when it is said with respect to the fundamental rights, that they are reasonably restricted. Restricted means they are not limited. But the power of the legislation is limited to what extent they can go. And if that conflict arises, then the court shall decide under Article 13, Clause 2, that any law which takes away or abridges the fundamental rights. So courts have done their part. And we have seen that greatly. If we start with Champakan Dorai Rajan, and then the second, like for example, when we focus on the Kerala Education Bill as well. So like, for example, we start with Champakam Dorai Rajan and then we go to in Re-Kerala Education Bill. Many have forgotten the Re-Kerala Education Bill because that was the first case wherein rather court said they directive principles as well as fundamental rights, when you deal with them, they complement each other, they supplement each other. You cannot just read them in isolation. But greatly people just focus on, they say Minerva Mills, people will go to then the Andhra Pradesh, the first case wherein the P. Unnikrishnan, wherein the right to education at the first time is part of Article 21 was said to be the part, and then we see that the now fundamental right is created, though it was a directive principle. So it's an ongoing process. So one cannot bring everything, but yes, directive principles play that important role. Directive principles, because state was not equipped then, state may get equipped or state become equipped, then they can make it to the people, they can offer it to the people. But at the same time, it is said that rights, when it talks about, and there is another problem, as a student of law, I strongly feel that what we require is the mindfulness amongst the lawmakers or the executors or even the ones who claim that they have the right. Because people talk about adhikar, they need to talk about kartavya as well. So when you talk about right, this I always cite in the classes, that it is specifically said whom the right is given, one who is capable of exercising it. So right is not to be utilized, right is to be exercised. So you need to know what would be its repercussion. But people just look at it as using the right. So they have to be clarified this point, that it is exercise of the right, not the use of the right. So when you exercise the right, at that time you also take care of the others, so that your exercise of right does not reflect on the other badly. It does not cause trouble to them. You rightfully said, sir. And I could see, and I was reading about you that with respect to the landless people, if I'm not wrong, sir, you were involved in that movement and you have seen it closely. And that's why you are able to talk about it so specifically, that yes, because we have to relate with it. There is a term, it's called samabhavana. You have to have that feeling. You will have it only when you face it. You don't face it, but you just say it. It's an emotionless thought. And I think that most of the arguments are emotionless, though they're talking about law, but they lack the emotions. As a result, we don't see that result. So today, when you specifically say it is good to blame, it is good to put that blot on the state, but let us reflect what I have done. So thank you very much for those words, sir. And I relate with that. Of course, we would not say what we do, but yes, we all shall do. I really felt bad when I read this, that, you know, the person who is coming to house as a housemaid, for example, they have been turned away by so many people. They said that they will get corona to their housemates. I don't know, I will not get into it. But why cannot? I know few of my colleagues who rather continued not allowing them coming home, but they continued paying them. Why? Because they were the ones who were assisting them at that time when they require them most. Now they require us most. So when this feeling of samabhavana would come, we don't require law, truly speaking, because we are learned to govern ourselves. We require law only when we cannot do things ourselves, then you require law to regulate. And you brought that point very well, and thank you very much, sir. I've been reading what you have been doing during this pandemic situation for many people, and it is really good to meet you. I'm not saying this as a director, but I'm happy that I could meet a person who also has been performing his role as a human being towards other human beings. So thank you very much for this, sir. And
thank you, Dr. Ravandeli.
Yes, sir. So all the things you said, I was so happy and I thoroughly enjoyed. And the questions all came. Those are personal, emotional, human touch questions, of course, and you entertained all those questions. So thank you very much on behalf of you.
Thank you.
We'll have to.
Thank you.
We'd like to have
you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Raj?
Raj, can you give the vote of thanks? I now invite you to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, on behalf of the organizers of Knowledge Series on Law and Justice and all the participants, we thank you for gracing the occasion and delivering such an enlightening lecture, sir. We feel privileged. We also like to express our gratitude to Lex Witness, THS the law firm, Sadgamya and Symbiosis Law School, Noida, led by the director and our mentor, Dr. Professor C.J. Ravanle, sir, for providing this platform to learn from the legends in our profession. I would also like to thank my colleague, Mr. Kumar Mihir, for moderating this session so well. Last but not the least, our sincere thanks to all the participants. We'll be back next weekend again with more eminent personalities and authority in the legal profession. We will forward the registration links soon to you, everyone. For those who missed the certain portions of the webinar, the video is available on the YouTube page of Symbiosis Law School. Do watch it. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day, sir.
Namaskar.
Bye, sir.